Tonight, we step into the world of medieval queens, where a private glance, a whispered rumour, or even the way a braid was worn could ignite scandal across an entire court. In this age, a queen's sexuality was never truly her own. It was a political weapon, a currency, and at times, her greatest danger. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy drifting through history's hidden truths with me. And I'd love to know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now let the room grow quiet, ease into the shadows of the past, and let's uncover the secrets of queens who lived and sometimes fell under the weight of scandal. Imagine a world where a queen's virtue wasn't judged in private, but paraded, legislated, and even whispered about at the dinner table. Among the medieval elite, marriage wasn't a personal choice. It was a political arrangement, and sexuality was regulated by law, religion, and social expectation long before a wedding night ever arrived. Virginity, in this context, wasn't only about purity. It was treated as a kind of currency, something courts could trade, frame, or weaponize. Some queens managed to turn this into an advantage. Others found it became the same story that undermined them, and it often began with the body itself. Virginity in the medieval world lived in a strange space. Everyone knew it was private, yet it was always treated as public. For queens and princesses, it became a kind of public secret. It wasn't about love, and only rarely about choice. Instead, it carried the weight of politics, standing as a pledge between families, kingdoms, or church authorities. Among elites especially, a young woman's body could symbolize far more than herself. It could mark the promise of an alliance, the seal of a peace treaty, or the price of a contested inheritance. From the start, daughters were reminded that chastity was not theirs to enjoy or test. It was framed as a form of family wealth, a resource that could be spent to gain favor or cement power. And because inheritance laws depended on legitimate heirs, purity wasn't presented in soft or romantic tones. It was spoken of as proof, evidence that heirs truly belonged to their fathers and dynasties were secure. Adding to this, canon law treated the first night of marriage as more than ceremony. If the marriage was not consummated, it could be annulled, erasing treaties, dowries, and political debts in a single ruling. Consummation, meanwhile, made the marriage legally binding. That is why everything hung on whether the bride was believed to be untouched. The oddity comes in how this was framed. On one hand, virginity was praised in soaring, nearly divine language. Priests compared it to sainthood. Songs and poems spoke of queens as radiant for their innocence. But away from the pulpit, the same women were quietly discussed as though they were contracts in human form. In back rooms and council chambers, her status was weighed against tracts of land, shipping rights, or troop numbers. One voice praised her as exalted, while another scribbled her name into a financial ledger. Everyone recognized the contradiction, but nobody stepped outside it. Mothers, often cast as protectors, became enforcers of rules that left daughters with little breathing room. In court politics, a girl spoken of as anything other than spotless lost value at once. Rumors alone could steal a crown. To prevent this, mothers worked as careful brokers, arranging matches, rehearsing manners, and warning endlessly against any behavior that could spark suspicion. It wasn't just motherly caution. It was preservation of dynastic strategy, sometimes laid out years in advance. The web widened further. Councils, courtiers, and even foreign ambassadors sometimes demanded proof of purity before a marriage contract could move forward. On rare but significant occasions, humiliating physical inspections were ordered, with midwives, priests, or appointed witnesses meant to provide assurance. These acts were framed as moral duties, but they were deeply political, and the praise of clerics reinforced the message. Chronicles spoke of untouched queens as radiant with God's blessing, the virgin state translated into a signal of divine favor for whole dynasties. Every portrait, song, or public word turned her into a symbol until her own voice nearly disappeared. In contrast, life outside the court often looked looser. In parts of Europe, young couples could enter trial unions, informal arrangements that sometimes included intimacy and only later led to official vows. Local customs allowed a woman already pregnant before marriage to proceed if the father accepted her as his bride. Variations like these remind us that strict ideals of virgin purity were most fiercely enforced among the ruling classes. For nobles and royals, the stakes were dynasties. For peasants, the stakes were lower and customs tended toward practicality. Still, the gap between those realities underscored the irony. Those who preached the loudest about virtue were often the most fearful of scandal, while those viewed as needing moral oversight hardly worried at all. Even in noble courts, small allowances could be made if politically useful. A discreet union before vows might be overlooked if the marriage still promised strong alliances. Virginity, then, wasn't always a bright line. It could bend, shift, or be reinterpreted when powerful people needed it to. Beyond the body itself, signals of virginity appeared in smaller but no less loaded forms. Hair became one of the clearest markers. Length, style, and coverings weren't simply matters of taste. They told everyone around you whether you were untouched, married, widow, or already promised. Uncovered flowing hair became an unspoken announcement of availability, while veils and coverings marked a woman as either reserved or no longer in that category. These codes were universally read in court, carrying messages far louder than the woman herself could ever speak. This was the heart of the public secret. Everyone already knew virginity was wrapped up with politics. Everyone knew it mattered less to the woman herself than to the people orbiting her life. But because it was so public, it had to be managed carefully, shaped into rituals, woven into chronicles, and carried into ceremonies where queens resembled holy icons. It had to be enforced through gossip, confirmed by reputation, and displayed through subtle visual codes. Virginity was not hidden away. It was paraded, and so the story never really stopped at the body alone. It reached into habits, styles, silences, and gestures, every feature loaded with meaning. Even something as ordinary as how a queen wore her hair could spark whispers at court. One look could suggest innocence, another could hint at scandal, all without a word spoken. It is here, in these small signs, that appearance became inseparable from judgment. Places where even the simplest style choices carried more weight than most speeches ever could. Hair might seem like a small detail, but in the world of medieval courts, it spoke volumes. The way a queen or princess wore her hair could carry messages just as powerful as anything written into law. Among elites, loose hair often signaled maidenhood and eligibility for marriage, while covered hair usually marked marriage or widowhood. These styles were less about beauty and more about status, and people at court learned to read them as carefully as they might read a contract or a treaty. For unmarried women, especially those nearing marriageable age, long braids adorned with ribbons or jewels quietly announced their position. Loose, flowing hair sent an even clearer signal of availability, whether or not the wearer wished it to. In many courts, these signals worked almost like advertising, broadcasting a woman's value to potential suitors and, by extension, her family's political ambitions. Once married, though, the same uncovered hair that had once glittered like a symbol of innocence became inappropriate. Brides who crossed the threshold into marriage were expected to cover their heads, using veils, hoods, or elaborate headdresses that concealed far more than they revealed. Widows carried their own set of rules. Their coverings tended toward darker fabrics, sometimes plain and devoid of decoration, emphasizing both mourning and sexual withdrawal. Custom varied across regions, but the patterns were clear enough to be understood instantly by anyone at court. These weren't fashion choices in a modern sense. They made up a system of signs, a language where each strand or covering placed a woman firmly within a category. This coded language turned hair into something close to theatre. People didn't just glance at a queen's hairstyle. They examined it, noted differences, and speculated on their meaning. If her hair was arranged in a way that didn't match her social stage, rumours could swirl. Was she suggesting remarrying soon? Was there a hidden lover in the background? Even small slips such as loose strands falling free could be exaggerated into markers of recklessness, reinforced by an audience eager to interpret. At feasts, processions, or even ordinary appearances, eyes followed details of style and covering more closely than words from the speaker's mouth. These interpretations went far beyond aesthetics. They often carried moral and religious overtones, since the church reinforced expectations about hair as part of its greater framework for chastity and obedience. Preachers compared uncovered hair on wives to Eve tempting Adam, while bridal hair on wedding days was celebrated as a pure, joyful offering. The same feature could be framed as virtue or temptation depending on the stage of life. This double standard was impossible to escape, and it made even the most personal decisions about grooming into matters of public significance. The result was that queens and noblewomen lived under constant surveillance. Every veil or braid told a story, whether or not it was one they wanted told. Choices of accessory mattered too. A jewelled net or circlet underscored wealth and dynastic strength, while a plain cloth could be read as restraint or humility. These items looked like fashion, but they were woven into political messaging that shaped how women were seen and judged at court. Accusations could spring from the simplest detail. Rivals didn't need hard evidence to undermine a queen's reputation. They could point to her hair. Slightly visible locks beneath a veil, a covering too sheer. These details could spark rumours of betrayal or schemes. Because hair was so visible, it could be weaponized instantly, read as proof of either modesty or impropriety depending on the mindset of the observer. No one asked queens what they meant with these choices. The meanings were assigned to them, often based on political advantage. The fascinating part is how normal this seemed within elite culture. In several regions, appearance worked like language, recognized and read by nobles and clergy alike. Court rituals reinforced the system. Coronations, weddings, and festivals included hairstyles as part of the symbolic performance. Appearances weren't just about pageantry. They scripted women into roles designed to reassure or occasionally unsettle the political audience watching. For women themselves, individuality was rarely an option. Something as simple as tying hair back on a hot day might be judged as improper or suggestive. The rules left no room for personal preference and very little room for error. Hairstyles became markers over which queens had no real control, since whatever they chose could be reinterpreted by observers who carried their own agendas. Even compliance rarely protected them, as suspicion found ways to attach itself to the smallest of deviations, so hair became more than adornment. It was politics displaced onto the body, a visible reminder of how thoroughly private life was made into public property. For queens, there was no escape from the gaze that judged them as though their hair itself testified about their loyalty, their fertility, or their ambitions. Their own voices could be ignored, while the way they appeared was taken as truth. In that imbalance lay enormous risk. And sometimes that risk proved decisive. There are accounts of queens whose reputations suffered, not because they confessed or were caught defying norms, but because the whispers around their appearance gained traction. Hairstyles carried weight that could tilt public opinion, strengthen rumours, or even help decide royal futures. We'll meet one such queen soon, a woman whose hair, and the gossip it provoked, shaped her destiny in ways she couldn't control. In that world of close watching and whispered judgment, another belief pressed even harder on women. The idea that they were born with a hunger men could never match. This wasn't something women claimed for themselves. It was assigned to them by clerics, by medical writers, and by traditions that reached back to antiquity. Queens, aristocratic women, even ordinary wives were all painted with the same brush. They were told that their bodies carried an appetite that, if not restrained, would cause men to stumble into moral failure. The message was constant, and for women in positions of visibility, it was inescapable. Much of it drew from ancient medical theory, especially the writings of Galen echoed later in Europe's universities. Physicians taught that women's bodies were cooler and wetter than men's, which supposedly made them more prone to urges that demanded release. In their view, orgasm wasn't indulgence but a way to keep the female body in balance. That claim became medieval proof that women were built for deeper craving. Of course, we should be clear. None of this reflected reality. It was theory passed off as scientific truth, accepted because it came wrapped in scholarship and diagrams. When combined with church teaching, it gave people a tidy way to argue that women were naturally inclined to excess. The church then layered on its own logic. Sermons and writings didn't stop at saying women wanted too much. They accused women of using that desire deliberately to tempt men into weakness. Eve, framed as the first to yield, became the portrait through which every other woman was judged. If Eve had brought sin into the world, then surely her daughters carried the same danger. In courts, this association was never far from reach. A queen accused of indiscretion wasn't just a wife at fault. She stood as a reminder of humanity's oldest story of downfall. That biblical shadow gave rumours extraordinary power, and once they circulated, there was no easy way to shake them off. The contradiction sat in plain view. Women were told they couldn't help but want more, yet at the same time they were blamed for wanting it all. Too much desire meant sin. Too little meant coldness or cruelty. Silence created space for others to invent motives on their behalf. The framework left women with no safe ground. Even their marriages emphasized the imbalance. Laws in both canon and secular courts assumed that once a union was consummated, consent was considered permanent. This made prosecution of marital rape nearly impossible, since the wife's original agreement to wed was taken to mean lifelong obligation. In practice, queens might wield influence at banquets and festivals, but privately they had little legal defense if their wishes clashed with their husband's claim of conjugal right. This legal and social matrix gave court rivals another tool. If a queen showed open warmth to a favorite courtier, enemies could interpret it as proof of forbidden craving. If she kept her distance, it might signal hidden disdain or suspected coldness. Either way, the reputation of insatiable appetite was ready to be applied. And once rumours stuck, they often spread faster than any denial could stop them. A glance across a hall could become the seed of a slander that grew into political weakness. Many never required evidence. The stereotype itself acted as the evidence. That trap was almost airtight. A woman could wear veils, move modestly, and demonstrate piety, yet still fall under suspicion from a murmur or two. Because the system defined women as guilty by nature, proof was unnecessary. Kings, councillors, and clerics could all justify action against a queen by pointing to common knowledge of female desire. Even saintly reputations could turn fragile. An admired ruler one month, an object of scandal the next. Everything rested on the willingness of those around her to grant protection, and once that shield dropped, accusations became nearly impossible to fight. For queens, the stakes were amplified. A farmer's wife might suffer gossip among neighbours, but for a woman at court, judgment came from chroniclers, bishops, foreign dignitaries, and a whole kingdom of eyes. Her body symbolised not just her own choices, but the morality of her realm. If she was accused of weakness, people worried it meant God's order itself was under threat, or that dynastic purity couldn't be trusted. One accusation could place treaties and successions at risk, not just reputations. And because fears about women's appetite were embedded in theology and law, there was no appeal to fairness. The presumption of guilt was too deeply woven into the story everyone already believed. So queens lived under a contradiction sharpened into a weapon, said to crave too much, yet punished for every sign of wanting at all. They carried the weight of anxieties about morality, inheritance, and divine order, invisible obligations that no degree of obedience could resolve. Their reputations were built less on what they did and more on what people felt women like them must be, always tempted, always dangerous, always in need of restraint. And yet, in some corners of medieval life, the framework looked different. Desire was something officials understood could not be erased, so they tried to manage it instead. So when rulers wanted to control sexuality across their towns, they sometimes turned to regulation rather than outright prohibition. Another way medieval societies tried to manage sexuality was by treating it almost like infrastructure, something to be organized, supervised, and put in the service of order. In many towns, prostitution wasn't simply tolerated, it was regulated. Brothels were not always tucked away in secrecy. In some places they were official, licensed spaces situated near gates, docks, or market squares where travelers passed through. They had established hours, often closed on holy days, and were taxed like other businesses. What might sound surprising to us now was, to city leaders, a straightforward solution. The reasoning behind this system came down to practicality. Authorities accepted that people would seek sex outside of marriage, even though church teaching condemned it. To avoid disruption of households or harassment of wives and daughters, councils presented prostitution as a lesser evil. The idea was simple: better to contain it in a defined space than let it spill unpredictably into homes, markets, or streets. Regulations reflected that view. Clothing rules, for instance, sometimes forced prostitutes to wear striped hoods or marked belts so their status was immediately visible. City ordinances went so far as to fix prices, locate brothels out of genteel neighborhoods, and ensure taxes reached the treasury. This was management, not approval. For towns, it served multiple purposes. A group of soldiers arriving at the gates could be directed to a brothel rather than roaming unrestrained in the streets. Travelers with money to spend could be guided into a place that profited the city directly. These establishments acted as a channeling device. They reduced the chances of violence, controlled spaces of desire, and gave councils revenue they otherwise lacked. Prostitutes themselves, however, bore the cost of the system. They were denied upward movement in society, excluded from respectable roles, and set apart by law. Their work came with physical danger and social stigma, but at least some legal protection existed, since their trade had an official standing. The logic rested less on morality than on preservation of hierarchy. By setting some women apart as fallen, towns could frame others, wives, daughters, and noble ladies, as securely pure by contrast. Queens and aristocrats benefited from this arrangement, though indirectly. Their distance from sex work reinforced their own reputations for sanctity. For city leaders, that separation was part of the civic fabric. The presence of sanctioned brothels gave people a ready contrast. Society could publicly rail against sexual sin while relying on its supervised existence to keep order. Church voices added to the contradiction. Preachers condemned the flesh from their pulpits, comparing prostitutes to shame and ruin. Yet the same communities quietly enforced rules about when brothels opened and how taxes were collected. Rather than spelling out the tension in lengthy moral terms, it's enough to notice how routine the split became. Sermons called it sin, councils called it policy. Prostitutes thus lived at the bottom of a carefully maintained structure. Ordinances restricted them from wearing fine fabrics or jewelry reserved for higher-class women, instead demanding noticeable markers of their station. Their labor-funded civic projects, but they could be shamed in festivals or even displayed in the margins of medieval art as symbols of vice. In this way, their marginalization became structural. Their visibility shored up the claim that noble women lived beyond such taint. For rulers, the system's convenience was clear. By outsourcing suspicion and impurity to a set group of women, queens remained above reproach in everyday discourse. But this only worked when social lines held. As soon as rumors suggested that a noble or royal woman crossed into behaviors associated with prostitutes, outrage surged. What queens were accused of was not just personal preference or private scandal. They were said to threaten the very separation the structure depended on. In cities across Europe, this contrast shaped how people imagined sexuality. It created a double world. On one side, respectable wives and queens paraded at festivals wrapped in silk and sanctity. On the other, women marked by clothing worked in sanctioned houses funded by taxes. The neatness of that divide was always fragile. When queens fell under suspicion, their supposed sins carried wider implications because they broke through a line towns had worked hard to police. That is why reputations mattered so much inside medieval politics. Authorities could treat sex as a public utility when it concerned anonymous women at the edge of town. But with queens, every rumour struck at the foundation of dynasties and treaties. If order was built by keeping lines in place, then scandal threatened to undo borders, both literal and symbolic. And soon enough, history offers us a vivid example. In one case, whispers about a royal woman's intimacies did not just shake a household or stir gossip, they altered the map of Europe itself. Sometimes the power of rumour didn't just shake reputation, it reshaped entire kingdoms. Few stories show this more clearly than that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential figures of the Middle Ages. Her legacy wasn't only tied to her wit or charisma, but to the vast lands she inherited. Aquitaine sprawled across southern France, rich with vineyards, fortresses, and trade routes. Whoever controlled it held one of Europe's greatest prizes. And as with so many queens, Eleanor's body and her reputation became inseparable from the politics that determined who held those riches. Her first marriage bound Aquitaine to the French crown. Eleanor wed Louis VII of France, and on paper it was an alliance that gave Paris enormous strength. But marriage at that level wasn't just about loving union, it was a political treaty. Almost immediately, tensions set in. Eleanor had a strong voice, sharp political instincts, and a confidence that unsettled a husband raised in monastic quiet. When she joined him on the Second Crusade, observers noted her unusual independence. She famously rode on horseback with her retinue while other women were conveyed by carts, and she engaged directly in political negotiations. Rumours soon spread that she was far too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, a respected statesman. Historians today doubt those claims or at least question them as political slander, but contemporaries repeated them as though they were fact. For Louis, already uneasy, the whispers only deepened the rift. The marriage crumbled, and when it fell apart, the political foundation it rested on collapsed with it. Once the annulment was sealed, Aquitaine no longer belonged to France. In practical terms, it was like removing half of a kingdom overnight. Eleanor was suddenly free again, her lands intact, and her status transformed her into the most powerful widow in Europe. Suitors lined up, knowing union with her meant not only prestige but dominion over some of the richest soil on the continent. She didn't linger in indecision. Within weeks she remarried, this time to Henry, Duke of Normandy. He would shortly become Henry II of England. The speed of her remarriage turned heads and fueled speculation. Some claimed she had been planning the union well before leaving Louis. There's no convincing evidence she betrayed her first husband, but perception mattered more than proof. Gossip painted her as calculating, restless, and already entangled with Henry, while still bound to the King of France. Those rumours only hardened the public image that clung to her for the rest of her life. Yet for her new husband, the prize outweighed the scandal. With their marriage came not only Normandy's strength, but also the huge expanse of Aquitaine. This transfer permanently disturbed the balance of power in Europe. The English crown now stretched its influence deep into French territories, making rivalries unavoidable. It wasn't that Eleanor's union alone caused later wars, but it undeniably tilted the stage. Her remarriage contributed to long-term Anglo-French tensions, conflicts that centuries later included the 100 Years' War. What mattered to contemporaries was not abstract dynastic theory, but the shock of watching an entire region pass from one crown to another on the basis of scandal and annulment. Unlike other queens who withered under accusation, Eleanor endured. Her reputation was tarnished in clerical writings, where she was caricatured as headstrong or lustful, but she kept her footing because she retained real material power. Aquitaine, still hers by inheritance, gave her leverage ordinary consorts lacked. Land was resilience, and it allowed her not merely to survive reputational blows, but to reposition herself as an indispensable figure in both French and English politics. Without her estates, her critics might have shunted her into obscurity. With them, she remained too significant to erase. Her life with Henry II hardly marked a retreat. She gave birth to heirs who dominated England's throne, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. When she and Henry quarrelled, she did not vanish into obscurity or exile. She joined rebellions against him, was imprisoned, and later re-emerged as regent while her sons fought abroad. Few women of her time, or of any time, managed such a cycle of defeat, resurgence, and persistence. The same accusations meant to silence her became reminders of her importance. Chroniclers returned to her name, sometimes in disapproval, but always acknowledging her presence. Meanwhile, other queens faced the same charges of lust or indiscretion and paid far heavier prices. Margaret of Burgundy, for instance, was accused of adultery in the 14th century, confined to a fortress and quickly erased from power. She had no robust network, no lands, and no independent base to protect her. Gossip alone was enough to break her fortunes and relegate her to obscurity. Eleanor's case underscores how much difference resources made. The slander was similar, but the outcomes diverged sharply. Where one woman lost everything, Eleanor maintained and even expanded her legacy. So, what was scandal to her? Defeat or opportunity? In truth, it was both. The rumours of infidelity shaped her in the minds of clerics and chroniclers, distorting her reputation into caricature. Yet at the same time, they magnified her presence in history, ensuring she was remembered not as a nameless consort, but as a political actor whose influence endured across decades. Scandal narrowed her reputation but widened her legend. And that duality hints at a broader truth. For figures positioned at the top of power, even whispered accusations could never be fully separated from the fate of entire nations. Eleanor's story shows how a queen's private life could ripple outward into public consequences, where a marriage bed became political terrain as contested as any battlefield. But while she managed to bend those narratives to her own purposes, most did not. For many queens, the rumours that stained Eleanor's chronicles became theirs too, but instead of resilience, they found ruin waiting at the end of the whisper. Sometimes the crown itself wasn't the heaviest burden for a queen. It was the weight of what others chose to believe about her. In courts where gossip travelled faster than letters and truth rarely stood a chance, rumours could turn invisible words into iron chains. A queen might stand at the height of ceremony one day and be cast into disgrace the next, undone not by armies or rivals on the battlefield, but by whispers tying her name to betrayal. Margaret of Burgundy's story shows how quickly the tide could turn. As wife to Louis, heir to the French throne, her position seemed secure. She lived within one of Europe's grandest dynasties, connected to wealth and influence. Yet in 1314, that security dissolved overnight in what became the notorious Tour de Nesle affair. Rumours accused her and her sister-in-law of adultery with knights close to the court. No proof was ever solidly presented, but few demanded it. Cultural expectations already cast women as naturally prone to lust, so suspicion alone was often enough to seal a fate. Margaret was declared guilty in public opinion before she had any chance to defend herself. Her supposed crime wasn't judged on evidence. It was judged on whether it seemed possible in the imagination of those who already assumed women were dangerous with desire. Soon after, she was imprisoned at Chateau Gaillard, a fortress now serving as her cage. There, cut off from politics and stripped of her voice, she faded into silence. She died in prison, remembered less for any decisions she made as queen and more for the scandal that marked her down. For her, biography became rumour, and rumour became history. Isabella of France faced a different path but the same trap of public judgment. Married to Edward II of England, she lived amid a court divided by his favouritism toward powerful companions, men who overshadowed her influence. Discontent grew, and so did the appetite for whispered stories. When Isabella allied with Roger Mortimer and eventually turned against her husband, rumours of intimacy between them leapt into chronicles and coloured nearly every account that followed. Whether true or not mattered less than how easily people could believe it. In 1326, she invaded England with Mortimer, deposed Edward II, and ruled as regent for her young son. She held real authority, but no matter what successes she achieved, her image was framed through suspicions about the man beside her. For her, politics and scandal marched together, one never escaping the other. These two cases weren't accidents of personality or chance. They reflect a cultural climate where tales of women's insatiability were assumed before they were proven. A queen accused of adultery wasn't just accused of a personal failing. Her scandal put succession into question, casting shadows on whether heirs were legitimate in the eyes of dynastic politics. The stakes of rumour spread far beyond a woman's private life. It carried the potential to unsettle kingdoms. That is why gossip became a weapon so effective, easier and cheaper than armies, yet capable of altering futures. Margaret and Isabella both show how fragile a queen's standing could be. Margaret lacked the leverage to resist and lost everything: her court, her freedom, even her remembrance. Isabella, by contrast, still had land, allies, and a son who could inherit the throne. That material base meant she could survive slander, even wield power in its shadow, though the stain of scandal never left. Her. The contrast between them shows how rumour alone wasn't always the final blow. It was whether a queen still had resources strong enough to endure after it landed. This was the battlefield no one could see, reputation itself. Rivals planted stories, clerics repeated them, and communities believed them because they fit familiar teachings. A woman's conduct in politics could be reduced overnight to a story about whom she did or didn't love. Queens lived in that trap daily, knowing that the wrong whisper could erase years of work. Some fell beneath it entirely, a few managed to twist it into a kind of reluctant power. But if marriage placed women beneath their husbands' shadows, the picture often shifted at a different stage of life. Where rumour pinned them down in one role, changing circumstances could sometimes loosen those constraints and open unexpected paths. For many queens, the moment came not in the height of their marriages, but after those marriages ended. Widowhood, with its mourning veils and new responsibilities, offered sudden room to act where little had existed before. For many queens, the moment their husbands died became a strange turning point. They stepped into a role the medieval world rarely imagined for them, one with unexpected freedom. A wife was bound by duty, her choices limited by obedience to her husband and his family. But as a widow, the same woman could suddenly direct estates, command revenues, and act in her own name. Mourning veils might suggest passivity from the outside, yet underneath them often stood a figure exercising influence that few had allowed her before. The key was law. Customary practice across Europe recognized the widow's right to a dower, a portion of land and income reserved for her upkeep. By controlling dower lands and household revenues, a widow effectively managed the lifeblood of her family's fortune. She might oversee harvests, deal with tenants, and resolve disputes, duties usually tied to male authority. For queens, this could extend even further. With no husband to eclipse them, widowed consorts became protectors of inheritances, and at times the linchpins holding whole realms steady during succession crises. This sudden authority often brought tension. Relatives and heirs sometimes saw widows less as guardians and more as obstacles. A widow with access to income could fund her own networks or simply refuse to release land. Pressure to remarry was constant. a quick way to neutralize her independence. If she resisted, relatives or rivals might move against her, reducing her influence. What power she wielded depended on allies, local, customs, and her ability to walk the fine line between expectation and autonomy. Some widows carried this authority into the heart of governance. When kings left heirs too young to rule, their widows sometimes stepped in as regents, making decisions as caretakers of the realm. In that role, they were not symbolic figures. They presided over councils, approved laws, even raised armies if necessary. Chroniclers softened the image, describing them as mothers guiding children. But the reality was more direct. For years at a time, these women acted as heads of state, even if history later veiled their authority beneath stories of grief and nurture. Of course, widowhood did not erase suspicion. A woman acting alone with wealth and political voice unsettled a system built to keep her dependent. If she embraced her role too openly, she risked being accused of arrogance or usurpation. If she remarried quickly, it could look like ambition. If she waited too long, whispers suggested schemes or secret lovers. Male writers circulated jokes about widows as calculating or lustful, using humour to cut down the legitimacy of their influence. No matter how they moved, widows lived under eyes ready to reframe their choices as scandal. Despite this, some managed to transform these fragile years into lasting prominence. Records show widows skillfully managing estates, expanding patronage of churches, or positioning children in strong marriages. Others wielded authority in regency councils, ensuring their heirs came of age with dynasties intact. In each case, widowhood offered opportunities their lives as wives had rarely provided. If they survived political pressure, they gained agency that reshaped the course of kingdoms. What makes widowhood striking is how accidental the freedom was. Law did not intend to elevate women, yet in the moment of a husband's death, loopholes and customs left space where female authority could stand. Sometimes the space was narrow, forcing women into careful compromise. Other times it opened into extraordinary influence, turning queens into rulers in everything but name. That uneasy balance set the stage for something larger. There were queens who found influence only when circumstances bent the rules, and then there were those who claimed rule outright. If widows sometimes navigated authority from behind veils, a few others stood openly before their courts, commanding armies and redefining the crown itself. Some queens did not wait for permission to lead. They stepped into the role of sovereign rulers, holding authority usually reserved for men. Two of the clearest examples are Wu Zetian in China and Tamar of Georgia, different in their settings and traditions, yet linked by the fact that they ruled directly, not as proxies or caretakers, but as leaders in their own right. Both faced criticism, both faced rumour, but neither let that define their reigns. Wu Zetian's rise was unprecedented. Living in a court that expected women to serve as consorts or mothers, she instead declared herself emperor in 690, the only woman in Chinese history to claim the title outright. Chroniclers hostile to her authority struggled to explain her success, so they turned to familiar tools: scandal, rumour, and accusations of sexual manipulation. Records accused her of seducing emperors, keeping lovers, and poisoning rivals. Yet many of those accusations reflected political attacks and later propaganda rather than straightforward proof. By framing her as a woman of unrestrained desire, detractors could cast her reign as unnatural. The contrast between the chronicles and her actual governance is striking. Where critics painted her as a temptress and criminal, Wu Zetian was in fact reorganizing state authority. She expanded the civil service exam system, opening paths for men from less aristocratic families to serve in government. She strengthened central administration and ensured her dynasty's grip remained stable for decades. Official histories derided her as an aberration, but the empire under her rule endured. A woman on the throne was unthinkable, so the chroniclers distorted her reign into something monstrous. Still, the bureaucracy she cultivated outlasted her critics, sustaining China beyond her lifetime. These painted images of corruption reveal more about the anxieties of her opponents than about Wu Zetian herself. If she had truly been as fragile or illegitimate as they claimed, her dynasty would have collapsed. Instead, it flourished, evidence that accusations of immorality were less about truth and more about undermining a woman who dared to command absolute power. Across the continent, another queen faced suspicion, though in very different surroundings. Tamar of Georgia ruled from 1184 to 1213, often remembered as presiding over Georgia's golden age. Unlike many queens who acted through husbands or regents, Tamar took command directly. She guided policy, managed the balance between nobles and church leaders, and oversaw military campaigns that expanded her kingdom's reach. Contemporaries praised the prosperity of her reign, but critics still reached for familiar ways to question her sovereignty. The collapse of her first marriage became a focal point for that criticism. Her husband, Yuri Bogolyubsky, openly challenged her authority, sparking rebellion. Instead of yielding, Tamar annulled the marriage, exiled him, and defeated his later armed attempts to reclaim power. Chronicles sometimes shifted credit to her commanders, but the decisions came from her. She chose to face opposition, assert control, and secure her independence as ruler. Her firm response silenced doubts and left little question that she held the crown in her own right. Like Wu Zetian, Tamar's power prompted resistance from elites uneasy with a woman in command. Nobles questioned her rule, rumors circulated about her personal life, but the reality on the ground contradicted them. Under her authority, Georgia fought off invasions, extended its territory, and strengthened ties with surrounding states. What might have been a fragile reign endured long enough to leave a durable legacy. The parallels between these two stories highlight a recurring pattern. When women ruled directly, their opponents often reached for sexualized narratives to describe them. In both cases, critics questioned legitimacy by framing female rule as unnatural, their authority reduced to tales of passion or scandal. Yet the motives behind those accusations differed across contexts. Imperial China, Christian Georgia, and their surrounding cultures each had their own anxieties. What stayed consistent was the convenience of such stories, easily believed in societies already primed to doubt women in power. Even so, their achievements show through the layers of propaganda. Wu Zetian reshaped governance in ways that gave new classes access to the imperial bureaucracy. Tamar protected and expanded her kingdom during a high point in Georgia's history. Both women remain vital figures not because of the rumors attached to them, but because of what their policies accomplished. Accusations and propaganda offered opponents an easy way to challenge them, but they also left traces that tell us how remarkable their reigns must have seemed at the time. Chroniclers felt threatened enough to embed scandal into their legacies, but the survival of records of practical achievements means the balance between rumor and reality continues to speak. Across cultures, accusation and propaganda were convenient tools to question female rule, yet the administrative achievements of these queens remain historically significant, which brings us to a different kind of court setting. Not one where armies march or dynasties are secured, but places where politics dressed itself in celebration. In those bright halls filled with music, feasts, and ritual, power and scandal often worked side by side. Holiday courts were never just celebrations. They were assembled stages where queens and kings oversaw rituals packed with meaning, and where everyone present watched for signals that could confirm or threaten alliances. To us, a feast might conjure comfort, but in the medieval world its meaning was layered, a display of ritual, hierarchy, and gossip. The actors in this theatre weren't telling stories, they were living them. Every seating chart, every goblet passed, every piece of bread offered was read as a sign of who stood inside the circle of power and who hovered at its edges. Seasonal festivals, especially around Christmas, carried long echoes of older traditions. Medieval people adapted parts of Roman Saturnalia's role reversals into Christian celebrations. visible in the Lord of Misrule, who briefly presided over feasting and foolishness on Twelfth Night. This blend of piety and inversion left the holiday courts charged with tension. They were meant to show harmony, but their crowded halls often brought simmering rivalries face to face. Wine, song, and license loosened restraints, even as the rituals demanded close observance of respect and rank. That contradiction made them some of the most fraught moments in the political calendar. Queens played an active role in this environment, not simply as companions to kings, but as orchestrators of loyalty. Gift-giving was one of their most visible tools. A piece of jewellery handed to one courtier and not another was not personal whim, but a signal understood instantly by everyone watching. The seating of guests carried similar weight. To sit close to the queen reflected favour, to sit distant implied loss of influence. These choices were noted, dissected, and discussed for months afterward. A queen could elevate her kin, strengthen alliances, or strategically exclude rivals simply by how she distributed presents and attention in the feast. Beyond seating and gifts, rituals added layers of meaning. The formal passing of the ceremonial cup could announce allegiance as clearly as a signature on parchment. A queen placing it in one man's hands while overlooking another transformed an ordinary action into a public endorsement. These gestures multiplied across an evening, each one magnified in an atmosphere where chroniclers and rivals alike tracked every move. Missteps lingered. What appeared minor in the moment returned as ammunition in later debates, trials, or stories. Festivals also opened the door for rumour. Part of this came from the atmosphere itself. Drinking eased tongues, laughter emboldened comments, and sudden moments of frivolity gave rise to gossip given half in jest and remembered as truth by dawn. A queen glanced toward a noble she happened to greet warmly, and the next day people whispered of secret attachments. A dance repeated too often with the same partner became evidence of hidden affection. Stories fed on the looseness of the occasion, travelling from feasting halls into chronicles where they hardened into permanent blemishes on reputation. One detail that deepened the tension was the presence of ritual foods and traditions with symbolic connotations. People remembered the centerpiece of the boar's head, sometimes served with ceremony as a token of abundance. They marked the greenery hung across halls or holly and mistletoe with echoes of fertility and continuity. These details gave colour and weight to the occasion, adding to the sense that gatherings held more than merriment. To step into such a hall was to step into a living map of alliances, layered with ritual and rumour alike. For queens, this was both risk and opportunity. As wives, they were cloaked by their husband's greater authority. As hostesses, they could act through subtler channels. A timely gift could secure stronger loyalties than speeches ever could. A careful smile offered in public might salvage an ailing alliance. At the same time, each gesture was monitored. A missed glance, a silent refusal to honour a guest could feed weeks of speculation. Even for the most careful queen, the openness of the setting heightened the chance of accusations she could not refute. With the whole hall watching, privacy was impossible. The danger was not only abstract. Some holiday gatherings became the backdrops for conspiracies or even violence. Rebellions were whispered over goblets while jesters performed to distract the crowd. Nobles bent their heads together while servants moved unseen, spreading fragments of conversation into corners of the feast. Chroniclers remembered rare but telling episodes when holiday feasts turned bloody, reminding everyone how thin the line between celebration and collapse could be. What's striking is how public joy and private suspicion meshed seamlessly together. Holiday courts required queens to wear two faces, the gracious hostess smiling at her guests while quietly marking who supported her, who betrayed her, and how reputations shifted from one toast to the next. Feasts that should have ended with laughter often lingered for years in the form of scandal, remembered not for music or ceremony, but for rumours attached to their queens. In this way, holiday rituals collapsed the private into the public. Dancing, serving, smiling, actions that in another place might have been ordinary, became risks. The queen's body, her gestures, her gaze carried signals interpreted by rivals far beyond her intention. Year after year, the 12 days of Christmas brought both ceremony and surveillance, always leaving behind stories that reshaped how she was judged. A performance of unity became a seedbed for suspicion. These gatherings remind us that queens lived in constant contradiction. Hospitality, ritual, and festivity shaped them into icons of joy and stability, yet the same circumstances made them targets for scandal. A gift could forge loyalty. A misplaced glance could spark ruin. Formal hierarchies became entangled with gossip, and gossip carried consequences deep into politics. And in those glittering halls, a single glance could become a scandal that lasted generations. Behind all the rituals and stories lies a pattern that shaped medieval queens more deeply than crowns or ceremonies. This was the paradox that defined their lives. Their sexuality was treated as their own, yet never truly belonged to them. 3 points stand out when we look back. First, virginity and sexual behavior were public, legal, and symbolic among elites. They were not private matters hidden in households. A young woman's virginity was advertised like a guarantee of alliance. Chastity could be praised in poetry, but it was also regulated in law courts, annulment cases, and even humiliating inspections. From hairstyle to wedding ritual, sexuality was built outward into public view, interpreted as proof of family honor or dynastic security. Second, accusations of misconduct were made believable by intellectual frameworks of the time. Medical traditions from Galen described women as naturally more lustful, while Christian teaching cast them as prone to temptation. With that assumption already laid down, almost any accusation could be stretched into something that sounded plausible. It was less about proof and more about how easily behavior could be read through this lens. Many charges were amplified because courts and clerics had incentives to interpret women's conduct not as ordinary human action but as political threats. A glance or gesture was rarely taken at face value. It could be inflated into a story that justified removing a queen from influence or reshaping a succession. Third, scandal did not always destroy. Some queens managed to endure or even redirect it. Eleanor of Aquitaine was accused repeatedly of infidelity or scheming, yet her inheritance of Aquitaine kept her influential long after her marriages ended. Isabella of France carried the shadow of supposed adultery, but she moved through it to place her son on England's throne. Wu Zetian faced chronicles saturated with slander, but while her critics wrote, she secured her empire through reforms. In each case, survival came not through purity of reputation, but through resources, allies, and careful use of symbols that softened or repurposed scandal. Personal will mattered, but material backing often decided who endured. From these points, the paradox becomes clearer. Queens were celebrated as holy figures of purity and condemned as dangerous seductresses, often within the same lifetime. Their bodies became shorthand for questions about borders, inheritances, and divine favor. Allegations against them weren't only about morality, but about rearranging power. Scandal was not peripheral to politics. It was one of its instruments. And so, queens were never only themselves. They lived under narratives imposed from outside, their real choices confined by stories already expected of them. Their power rested on embodying contradictions, to appear pious yet politically useful, to show humility while exercising influence, to accept slander while surviving within it. Some collapsed under the pressure, others found ways to keep moving through the shadows that rumour cast. This is the paradox unveiled. Intimacy was public, appearance was evidence, and stories of desire did the work of armies. Queens endured it with different fates, but the pattern remained. And if we listen closely, we begin to notice the deeper lesson. These women were not only living their lives, they were also living inside the stories others chose to tell. In medieval Europe, the image of a queen was not only tied to her political and dynastic role, but also to the constant fear that her sexuality might overflow the carefully policed boundaries of courtly life. For centuries, the Church had taught that women were naturally more susceptible to temptation, more inclined toward lust, and more vulnerable to the devil's influence. This made them, in the imagination of clerics and chroniclers, the perfect vessels for witchcraft. And when the woman in question happened to be a queen, her alleged dabbling in sorcery carried not just personal but political consequences. Witchcraft in the Middle Ages was never purely about casting spells. It was a language through which male authorities, clerics, judges, or political rivals explained female influence that they could neither control nor fully understand. When a queen wielded charisma or when she bent powerful men to her will, it was easier for her enemies to say she had used potions and incantations than to admit she possessed intelligence, charm, or political skill. Her bedchamber and her supposed cauldron merged into one threatening image. Accusations of erotic sorcery were especially potent. Chroniclers whispered of queens who secured the devotion of kings by slipping them enchanted brews, or who sapped their vigor by nocturnal rites that drained their willpower. Such claims were almost never backed by evidence, but they reflected genuine anxiety about female sexual power in a society where the balance of authority was meant to rest firmly in male hands. Take the example of Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. She lived during the reign of Charles VI, a king plagued by bouts of madness. As his illness deepened, rival factions at court scrambled for influence, and Isabeau's own reputation was weaponized against her. Rumors spread that she had bewitched the king, either to gain control over him or to weaken him deliberately. Chronicles accused her of debauchery, promiscuity, and occult practices, blending real political tensions with a fascination for sexual scandal. To suggest that she used sorcery in her private encounters was to imply that her authority was illegitimate, that it came not from her position as queen but from the dark arts. Another notorious figure was Joanna of Naples, who reigned in the 14th century over one of the most contested thrones in Europe. Joanna faced multiple coups, accusations of murder, and open hostility from the papacy. Chroniclers hostile to her claimed that she combined lust with witchcraft, seducing men and then binding them to her through forbidden charms. For her enemies, it was easier to accuse her of spellcasting than to acknowledge her political maneuvering in a violent, unstable kingdom. These stories were not confined to Western Europe. In Byzantium, empresses such as Zoe Porphyrogenita were rumoured to employ potions and magical ointments to maintain their youthful appearance and keep their lovers enthralled. Byzantine sources often described women at court experimenting with perfumes, cosmetics, and herbs in ways that blurred the line between medicine and sorcery. When Zoe, well into her 60s, continued to command the passion of younger men, whispers of erotic magic became a way to explain what contemporaries could not otherwise rationalize. Underlying these accusations was a cultural fear, the belief that women's sexuality, if left unchecked, could unman even the strongest ruler. Witchcraft offered a framework for that fear. Erotic magic supposedly allowed a queen to invert the expected hierarchy, making the king dependent on her rather than the other way around. The idea that a woman could enthrall a monarch with nothing more than a glance, a touch, or a sip of enchanted wine was terrifying to a world built on patriarchal authority. The Church reinforced these anxieties. Theologians wrote treatises warning of women who consorted with demons and used their bodies as conduits for temptation. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch hunter's manual published in 1487, insisted that women were more carnal than men and therefore more likely to practice witchcraft. Though the text appeared at the tail end of the medieval period, it reflected centuries of suspicion. Queens who were perceived as too influential, too sexual, or simply too independent could be branded with the same stigma as village women accused of flying on broomsticks. It is telling that most accusations of erotic witchcraft against queens appeared during moments of political instability, when a king was weak, when factions battled for control, or when foreign powers intervened. The queen's role often became the focus of scrutiny. If she showed loyalty to one side, she might be accused of enchanting them. If she opposed another, she was said to have cursed them. The language of sorcery allowed enemies to disguise political attacks as moral and spiritual outrage. What makes these stories so fascinating is not whether they were true. There is no reason to believe that most queens ever practiced anything resembling witchcraft, but how they reveal the intersection of power, sexuality, and fear. To accuse a queen of erotic sorcery was to strip her of dignity while at the same time acknowledging her influence. It suggested that she mattered enough to be dangerous, that her private life had public consequences. Erotic witchcraft also reflected the wider medieval worldview, where the boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion were porous. A queen might use herbs for fertility, ointments for beauty, or prayers for health. To allies, these were natural remedies. To enemies, they became spells. The same act could be interpreted in radically different ways depending on the political context. Ultimately, the myth of the bewitched king or the sorceress queen endures because it captures a truth about medieval anxieties. Women in positions of power were seen not simply as political actors but as potential disruptors of the entire cosmic order. Their sexuality was never private. It was always a matter of public concern, open to judgment, gossip, and manipulation. In this way, accusations of erotic witchcraft served as both a weapon and a mirror. They were weapons in the sense that they could tarnish reputations, justify political coups, or rally support against a powerful woman. And they were mirrors in that they reflected the deep insecurities of a patriarchal society that feared losing control over its rulers and over itself. For queens, navigating this dangerous terrain meant balancing displays of piety, fertility, and obedience with the reality of wielding power in turbulent courts. Some succeeded in crafting an image that deflected suspicion. Others were consumed by the rumors. But all lived under the shadow of the belief that their sexuality might at any moment be reinterpreted as sorcery. Behind the thick stone walls of medieval palaces, where velvet curtains muffled whispers and guards kept the curious at bay, another world sometimes unfolded, one that mixed politics, sex, and secrecy. Chroniclers, travellers, and later satirists often wrote about hidden gatherings in which the most powerful women of the realm, queens, duchesses, and noble ladies, played roles that blurred the line between ritual, pleasure, and political theatre. These tales of secret courtly orgies fascinated contemporaries not because they were common, but because they struck at the heart of medieval anxieties. What happened when women of status stepped beyond the narrow bounds of chastity and obedience? If a peasant girl strayed, her sin was local scandal. If a queen or princess did, it threatened the symbolic fabric of the kingdom. The medieval court was not simply a household, it was the nerve centre of governance. Every gesture, every feast, every ceremony carried political meaning. Sex, too, could become part of this theatre. When rumours circulated of orgiastic gatherings involving noble women, they were rarely understood as private indulgence. Instead, they were interpreted as signs of corruption at the heart of power, evidence that those entrusted with the fate of nations were instead consumed by appetite. One of the most persistent stories comes from late medieval France. The infamous Ball of the Burning Men in 1393, where King Charles VI and courtiers dressed as wild men danced at a masquerade. The tragedy of fire overshadowed the event, but satirists later embroidered it with tales of sexual excess, insinuating that the queens and ladies present were as scandalous as the men's antics. Chroniclers linked noblewomen to the chaos, hinting at suggestive games played in shadowed chambers once the flames had been extinguished. Similarly, in Italy, accounts circulated of the courts of Ferrara and Naples, where powerful duchesses supposedly hosted midnight revels. These events, blending music, masked identities, and elaborate costumes, became the canvas on which later writers painted scenes of orgiastic abandon. Whether exaggerated or true, the suggestion that high-born women participated in such rites shocked and fascinated. Medieval thought often portrayed female sexuality as insatiable. Medical treatises of the time, drawing from Galenic theory, insisted that women craved sexual release more than men. In this framework, an orgy at court was not just scandalous, it was almost expected, the logical conclusion of allowing too much freedom to women of power. Queens accused of arranging or attending such events were cast as predators rather than victims. Their desire was seen as overwhelming, dragging others into sin. This narrative appears in the scandalous accusations levelled against Catherine the Great centuries later, though she was an early modern ruler, not a medieval one. Her story illustrates the persistence of this trope. When a powerful woman ruled, her sexuality was magnified into legend. What made these rumoured gatherings so effective as gossip was their secrecy. They were said to occur at night, in hidden rooms, behind locked doors. The lack of direct witnesses allowed the imagination to run wild. Servants, guards, or dismissed favourites might hint at what they had seen or heard, and the tale would grow in the retelling. The court of Eleanor of Aquitaine provides a vivid case. As Queen of both France and England, Eleanor was already notorious for her boldness. Chroniclers hostile to her claimed that she presided over courts of love where erotic games, including roleplay and licentious poetry, were celebrated. While modern historians doubt that these were actual orgies, the association of Eleanor with erotic festivity stuck. Her willingness to defy expectations, divorcing a king, accompanying crusades, commanding her sons in rebellion, made her a magnet for sexualized rumor. Some orgiastic tales even blended with religious parody. Chronicles describe feasts where noblewomen were said to eat and drink to excess, then turn the occasion into sexual play. These stories often echoed accusations later levelled against heretics like the Cathars or the Templars, who were claimed to hold secret rites of promiscuity. By attributing similar practices to queens and noblewomen, enemies painted them as not only immoral but sacrilegious. The fascination with such stories reveals how sex and power were inseparable in the medieval imagination. To imagine a queen in an orgy was to imagine the social hierarchy inverted, the woman dominating the stage, her body at once desired and feared, her authority expressed not through laws but through intimacy. Actual evidence of queens being punished for orchestrating such gatherings is scarce. What we find instead are reputational wounds. A queen might never be formally accused in court, but whispered rumours could alienate allies and embolden enemies. The charge of sexual excess was a political weapon, impossible to fully disprove, devastating once it spread. Consider Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Known as the she-wolf of France, Isabella's political manoeuvring against her husband was entangled with charges of lust and moral corruption. Chroniclers accused her of promiscuity, suggesting she presided over lewd entertainments. The image of the scheming, sexually voracious queen was more powerful than any sober record of her political strategies. Were secret courtly orgies real? Probably not in the way they were described. But their power lay not in their factual truth, but in what they symbolized. They expressed male fears of losing control, fascination with forbidden female desire, and the conviction that sexual disorder mirrored political disorder. Every time a queen's enemies whispered of orgies, they were really whispering about the fragility of monarchy itself. If the queen could not control herself, how could she help govern a kingdom? If her bedchamber was chaotic, was it any wonder the realm fell into chaos? Even today, these tales shape how medieval queens are remembered. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, and Joanna of Naples remain shadowed by accusations of erotic excess. Their political achievements, marriages that united kingdoms, rebellions that reshaped Europe, patronage that nurtured culture, are often overshadowed by salacious legends of the bedroom. These legends remind us that medieval history is not just a record of battles and treaties, but also of whispered fears and fantasies. The imagined orgies of queens were not simply about sex. They were about the boundaries of power, the fragility of reputation, and the ways in which women who stepped beyond expectation were branded as dangerous. For the medieval court, the rumor of an orgy could be as destabilizing as an actual rebellion. And for queens, surviving such whispers required navigating a world where desire and politics were inseparable, and where the most intimate rumors could shape the fate of empires. When we think of medieval queens and noblewomen, the image is usually shaped by chronicles written by men, women defined by their marriages, their children, and their political alliances. Yet beneath this surface, the private lives of some women have left behind tantalizing hints of same-sex intimacy, relationships that challenged the rigid gender and sexual norms of their time. Though often buried under accusations of sin or scandal, these traces reveal how female desire could operate in spaces both hidden and political. Medieval society placed women in segregated spaces, convents, chambers, and the inner circles of palaces. These environments, where women lived closely together, created conditions for deep bonds to form. In monasteries, letters and poems occasionally speak of passionate attachment between women, couched in the language of spiritual friendship but with undertones of longing. At royal courts, the same dynamic could play out. Queens were surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, personal attendants, and noble companions. In such environments, emotional intimacy sometimes spilled into physical intimacy. Chroniclers occasionally recorded rumors of unnatural love between women of high rank, not always to condemn but often to titillate or scandalize. One of the most infamous examples comes from Joanna of Naples in the 14th century. Though her political marriages defined her rule, hostile accounts from her enemies accused her of preferring the company of women. Whether or not these rumors reflected truth, they demonstrate how same-sex desire was understood at the time, as both a weapon of slander and a possibility that lurked in court life. Unlike heterosexual affairs, which could at least produce heirs or alliances, lesbian relationships were seen as doubly threatening. They defied both marital duty and the assumption that women's sexuality existed only for men. A queen accused of intimacy with her attendants risked being portrayed as abandoning her role as wife, mother, and symbol of dynastic continuity. This made such accusations powerful tools. If a ruler's enemies wanted to destabilize her, they could whisper not merely of adultery but of unnatural practices. Such charges painted her as unfit for the order of Christian society. In some cases, this rhetoric drew upon biblical imagery, equating female-female intimacy with Sodom and moral corruption. Interestingly, traces of lesbian desire also appear in medieval literature. Troubadour poetry, written in the courts of southern France where Eleanor of Aquitaine held sway, occasionally featured verses celebrating love between women. Later, in Renaissance Italy, Boccaccio and others hinted at such relationships in their stories of courtly intrigue. These works often blurred lines between reality and fantasy. They reflected not only the possibility of intimacy between women but also male fascination with it. When chroniclers recorded tales of queens or noblewomen indulging in same-sex affairs, they were often as interested in titillating their audiences as in recording events. The eroticization of lesbian relationships became a way to both condemn and sensationalize powerful women. While many of these accounts are hostile, they also reveal how women might have found agency within oppressive systems. In a world where their bodies were often treated as political tools, married off to cement alliances, scrutinized for signs of fertility, or condemned for alleged excess, same-sex intimacy offered a sphere outside male control. Relationships between women could provide emotional refuge from arranged marriages, physical pleasure in an environment of constant surveillance, and solidarity in courts dominated by male power. To suggest that queens or noblewomen may have sought such connections is not to impose modern categories of identity onto the past, but to recognize that desire can find expression even in restrictive contexts. Because lesbian affairs posed no threat of illegitimate heirs, they were often treated with silence rather than open punishment. The Church condemned all sodomy, but female-female intimacy was less frequently prosecuted than male homosexuality. Part of this was disbelief. Many medieval men simply could not imagine women experiencing pleasure without them. When such affairs were acknowledged, they were usually framed as evidence of a woman's depravity rather than as a concrete crime. For queens, the damage was reputational rather than legal, a whisper that their desires were unnatural, making them easier to paint as dangerous or unfit to rule. Rumours of same-sex desire even touched the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Chroniclers hostile to her claimed that during her time in Antioch she grew unusually close to her uncle, but other stories suggested she favoured the company of noblewomen in her retinue. While no solid evidence survives, the persistence of such tales shows how male writers framed powerful women's relationships through the lens of sexuality, unable to conceive of strong female bonds without erotic suspicion. What lesbian desire at court really threatened was the medieval order itself. If women could direct their love, loyalty, and pleasure toward each other, then men's claim to own their bodies was undermined. A queen with a female lover signalled a different kind of intimacy, one that could not be controlled by dynastic contracts or patriarchal expectations. That is why such accusations carried such sting. They were not just about sex. They were about power diverted from men to women. Even if most of these affairs remain hidden in rumour and innuendo, their very existence in the record shows how pervasive the fear and fascination with same-sex intimacy was in medieval Europe. Whether whispered in cloisters, suspected in the Queen's chamber, or imagined in poetry, lesbian desire was part of the mental world of the time. For modern readers, these stories remind us of the complexity of women's lives in the past. Medieval queens were not only pawns of marriage or symbols of dynasties. They could be figures of scandal, rumour, and desire, women whose very existence stretched the boundaries of what was thinkable. The whispers of lesbian love at medieval courts show us how gender, sexuality, and power were intertwined. They illustrate how even in eras of repression, human intimacy found ways to surface, shaping reputations and histories in unexpected ways. In medieval Europe, a king's adultery was often tolerated, even expected. Male rulers flaunted mistresses without fear of losing legitimacy, their virility seen as proof of strength. But for queens, love affairs were dangerous. A single rumour of infidelity called into question the legitimacy of heirs, the very foundation of dynastic succession. This double standard created a paradox. Queens were surrounded by handsome courtiers, knights, and ambassadors, yet their bodies were supposed to remain untouched except by their husbands. When they strayed, the scandal was magnified not only as a breach of morality but as a potential threat to the entire political order. One of the most famous forbidden affairs of the Middle Ages unfolded in England. Isabella of France, the queen consort of Edward II, lived through a marriage marked by neglect and humiliation. Edward openly favoured male companions, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, while sidelining his queen. Amid political unrest, Isabella found an ally and a lover in Roger Mortimer, a powerful Marcher lord. Together, they plotted not just an escape from Edward's dominance, but his overthrow. Their relationship became the nucleus of a rebellion. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a modest army, gaining support from barons weary of Edward's rule. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate in favour of his young son, Edward III. Mortimer and Isabella ruled as regents, openly living as partners. The scandal of their affair outraged many, not only because of the Queen's infidelity, but because it blurred the lines between love and power. Their dominance was short-lived. Edward III eventually seized power and had Mortimer executed. But the affair left a mark on English history, showing how a Queen's private rebellion could destabilise a monarchy. Another English queen, Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, became entangled in rumours that her closeness to Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was more than political. Henry VI's mental instability created a power vacuum, and Margaret fought fiercely to defend her husband's reign. Enemies claimed her son, Edward of Westminster, was not Henry's child, but Somerset's, an accusation designed to delegitimise the Lancastrian heir. Whether or not the affair occurred, the rumour alone undermined Margaret's position, fueling the fires of the Wars of the Roses. Here we see how forbidden love, real or imagined, could destabilise entire dynasties. For queens, desire was never just personal. It could become a weapon wielded by enemies, reshaping the fate of kingdoms. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval world, also found herself entangled in forbidden passion. Married first to Louis VII of France, she later wed Henry II of England, giving birth to the Plantagenet dynasty, but Eleanor's boldness, independence and beauty attracted rumours of affairs. Chroniclers accused her of improper intimacy during the Second Crusade, particularly with her uncle Raymond of Antioch. While likely exaggerated, these stories reveal how Eleanor's charisma blurred the lines between diplomacy and desire. Later, her rebellion against Henry II, supporting her sons in revolt, was sometimes interpreted through the lens of her rumoured affairs. Whether she truly had lovers or not, the suspicion alone reinforced her image as dangerously uncontrollable, a queen whose personal passions could topple kings. In Scandinavia, queens were not immune to forbidden love either. Christina of Denmark, though later in the Renaissance, inherited the legacy of medieval scandal when widowed young. She resisted political remarriage and became known for her wit, famously declining Henry VIII of England's proposal by saying she would rather have 2 heads than only one. Rumours surrounded her interactions with certain noblemen, suggesting she may have pursued love outside political expectation. Though less documented than in England or France, such whispers were enough to complicate alliances and fuel gossip across courts. Forbidden love affairs were not always genuine passions. Sometimes they were invented, spread as political weapons to destroy queens' reputations. A queen accused of adultery could be painted as unchaste, her children illegitimate, her very presence on the throne a scandal. This tactic was used against queens across Europe. The mere suggestion of an affair could be enough to destabilise a dynasty. Unlike kings who thrived on their mistress's visibility, queens were shackled by the expectation of purity. For the women themselves, the price of love could be catastrophic. Queens caught in genuine affairs faced imprisonment, exile, or even death. Noblewomen accused of intimacy with the wrong man could be shamed, stripped of titles, or forced into convents. But for some, like Isabella of France, passion and politics fused into revolution. In those rare cases, forbidden love did not only ruin reputations, it redefined power itself. The stories of these forbidden affairs remind us that queens were not passive figures. They had desires, frustrations, and ambitions. When they pursued love outside the bounds of their marriages, the shockwaves reached far beyond the bedroom. Dynasties shook, wars erupted, and reputations shattered. In a society where women's bodies symbolized dynastic continuity, forbidden desire became political dynamite. Queens risked everything when they followed their hearts, and history has never forgotten them. When we imagine medieval courts, we often picture solemn ceremonies, tournaments, and religious rituals. But beneath the surface of pomp and protocol, courts also hosted entertainments that could shock, arouse, or scandalize contemporaries. Far from being merely private indulgence, these spectacles often unfolded before dozens, even hundreds, of witnesses, blurring the line between celebration and seduction. Medieval rulers understood that their courts were theatres of power. Every feast, dance, or procession carried symbolic meaning, projecting wealth, authority, and prestige. Yet the same stage that displayed political grandeur could also showcase sexual intrigue. Queens and noblewomen were often caught at the centre of these performances, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly, their reputations shaped by how their conduct was interpreted in the spectacle. Court dances were never only about movement, they were rituals of proximity. Partners exchanged glances, brushed hands, or whispered under the cover of music. Some chroniclers suggest that noblewomen used dance as a coded language of desire, a way to test boundaries within an environment where every touch was observed. Masks, elaborate performances with costumes, disguises, and allegorical themes often allowed courtiers to assume roles they could not otherwise play. Men appeared as gods of love, women as mythological seductresses. The anonymity of masks created room for flirtation and scandal. A queen who lingered too long in conversation with a masked knight might spark rumours of forbidden attraction even if the encounter was innocent. In certain courts, allegorical plays performed during banquets contained thinly veiled references to the host's own private affairs. A drama about a goddess betrayed by her husband could be interpreted as commentary on the queen's marriage. A tale of a knight stealing away a lady could fuel gossip about real relationships simmering behind palace walls. Banquets were the most public stage for royal life, and they frequently mixed food, drink, and spectacle in ways that pushed the limits of propriety. Accounts survive of feasts where dancers performed nearly nude, where symbolic foods were shaped into erotic forms, or where fools mocked queens with suggestive humour. One infamous example comes from the court of Philip the Good of Burgundy, whose lavish banquets included theatrical displays of such extravagance that guests described them as bordering on indecent. During one, a young noblewoman appeared on a mechanical whale that opened to reveal her nearly unclothed, representing a sea goddess emerging from the depths. Though framed as allegory, the shock of the scene lay in its obvious sensuality. Queens, too, sometimes staged spectacles of their own. In certain instances, noblewomen hosted private entertainments for trusted circles, where songs, poetry, and dances carried themes of love and desire too bold for public ritual. These occasions, whispered about in chronicles, helped fuel the image of courts as places of secret indulgence. Perhaps no queen better embodied the fusion of spectacle and scandal than Joanna I of Naples. Known for her charisma and boldness, she cultivated a court where entertainments were extravagant and suggestive. Chroniclers hostile to her rule claimed she staged feasts where courtiers exchanged partners in dances that bordered on the indecent, and where she openly favoured young lovers among the knights. Whether exaggerated or not, these descriptions reveal how entertainments became linked with a queen's sexual reputation. For Joanna, the accusation of indulgence undermined her authority, fueling opposition among conservative factions. Yet for her supporters, the same acts projected vitality and defiance, proof of her refusal to conform to restrictive gender norms. In some courts, entertainments even took the form of staged trials. A nobleman might be accused of loving a lady too boldly, and the lady herself called to testify. These performances, though meant as jokes, often exposed the fragile boundaries between play and reality. For queens, participation was fraught with risk. To laugh at a suggestive accusation could be read as tacit admission. To refuse could brand her cold or prideful. Such spectacles created opportunities for rivals to interpret every gesture as evidence of hidden desires. One of the most controversial aspects of medieval court entertainment was its blending of sacred and profane themes. During carnival or festive seasons, queens sometimes joined in rituals where traditional hierarchies were inverted. Servants mocked nobles, women dressed as men, and priests performed parodies of mass. These moments of reversal allowed normally suppressed desires to surface. Chroniclers described queens laughing at bawdy jokes or taking part in masquerades that mocked clerical celibacy. Critics later used these accounts as proof of irreverence, painting queens as not only sexually indulgent but also morally corrupt. To modern eyes, these entertainments may look like harmless fun or exaggerated rumour. But in a world where a queen's honour symbolised dynastic legitimacy, even small breaches of decorum could have massive consequences. If a queen seemed too comfortable in sexually charged performances, enemies could argue she endangered the moral foundation of the court. If she resisted or appeared prudish, she risked alienating courtiers who thrived on playful indulgence. The balance was delicate, and queens walked it constantly. As with love affairs, scandalous entertainments were often politicised. A rival faction could whisper that a queen laughed too freely at an obscene masque, or that she danced too closely with a favoured knight. These stories, repeated in taverns and chronicles, grew into reputations that sometimes lasted centuries. Even when queens had little control over the spectacles staged in their courts, they bore the burden of association. Their very presence, their reactions, gestures, and expressions became evidence of either virtue or vice in the eyes of contemporaries. Ultimately, court entertainments reveal how queens lived on a stage where nothing was truly private. Dances, feasts, masks, and spectacles all carried meanings that could be twisted into scandal. Sexuality was not confined to the bedroom. It was embedded in the rituals of courtly life itself. For queens labelled perverted by their enemies, the spectacle of entertainment became another arena where their reputations were built, attacked, and remembered. These moments remind us that medieval courts were not only places of solemn ritual, but also spaces where desire and politics danced together under the flicker of candlelight. Medieval queens rarely stood alone. They lived surrounded by noblewomen, mistresses, princesses, and ambitious ladies-in-waiting, each with her own agenda, alliances, and hidden influence. Within these tight circles, rivalries often brewed, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, and often in ways that reshaped politics as much as battlefields and treaties did. Sexuality, reputation, and whispers of scandal became powerful weapons in these struggles. In the medieval imagination, wars were fought with swords, but within the palace walls they were fought with glances, rumours, and alliances. A queen who enjoyed her husband's trust could wield enormous influence, but her rivals, mistresses, ambitious noblewomen, or even her own stepdaughters, might try to undermine that trust by portraying her as too indulgent, too sensual, or too scandalous to deserve the throne beside him. In these rivalries, sexual rumour became the sharpest blade. A suggestion that the queen had taken a lover, even without proof, could destabilise her authority. Unlike a knight who could defend his honour in combat, a queen's defence rested on reputation, which once damaged was nearly impossible to fully repair. Few queens navigated rivalries as dangerously as Eleanor of Aquitaine. Married first to Louis VII of France and later to Henry II of England, Eleanor brought wealth, beauty, and political acumen that made her one of the most powerful women in Europe. But her second marriage placed her in direct conflict with Henry's mistresses and with his daughters from other unions. Chroniclers hostile to Eleanor accused her of encouraging her sons to rebel against Henry, the so-called Great Revolt. Yet just beneath the political accusations lay insinuations of sexual rivalry. Eleanor, they suggested, resented Henry's lovers as much as his authority. These whispers painted Eleanor not simply as a strategist, but as a jealous woman, her political moves reduced to emotional vengeance. The strategy worked. For centuries, Eleanor's political brilliance was overshadowed by tales of her excessive passions, a portrait carefully crafted by rivals who knew the danger of her power. Another infamous rivalry played out in the early 14th century between Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England, and the king's favourites, Hugh and Hugh the Younger Despenser. Edward's obsession with the Despensers, particularly the younger Hugh, sparked rumours not only of political favouritism but of sexual intimacy. For Isabella, the humiliation was acute. Chroniclers described her as displaced in her own court, treated with coldness while the Despensers enjoyed Edward's affection and gifts. Isabella responded with quiet but dangerous precision. She cultivated alliances with discontented nobles and eventually launched an invasion of England with her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward II was deposed, and the Despensers were executed with brutal public spectacle. Here, rivalry fueled by sexual politics toppled a king. Isabella was vilified in later chronicles as the she-wolf of France, her affair with Mortimer portrayed as scandalous. But beneath the accusations lay the reality of a queen who turned personal humiliation into political revolution. One of the most persistent rivalries in medieval and early modern courts was between queens and royal mistresses. While the queen held legal authority as consort, mistresses often held the king's heart, and sometimes his ear in matters of state. At the French court, queens like Anne of Brittany and Catherine de' Medici constantly battled the influence of royal favourites. Mistresses could distribute patronage, shape foreign alliances, and undermine the queen's dignity by flaunting their intimacy with the king. For queens, the rivalry was especially cruel. To confront the mistress openly risked appearing jealous and weak. To remain silent risked losing influence altogether. Either way, whispers of sexual inadequacy or excessive jealousy could tarnish their image. Not all rivalries involved mistresses. Sometimes queens clashed directly with other royal women. Consider the case of Joanna II of Naples, whose reign was marred by conflict with ambitious noblewomen who accused her of promiscuity. At one point, rivals spread rumours that she had lovers brought to her chambers in secret tunnels, framing her as a ruler enslaved to desire. These accusations were less about truth than about power. By framing Joanna as overindulgent, her enemies sought to delegitimize her authority. To rule effectively, she needed loyalty from the nobility. To weaken her, they tarnished her sexual reputation. Rivalries weren't always between queens and equals. Often, ladies-in-waiting, women who served in intimate proximity to the queen, became conduits for scandal. Some courtiers accused queens of sharing lovers with their attendants. Others hinted at same-sex relationships, which shocked medieval moralists and made for sensational gossip. Because ladies-in-waiting were so close to the queen, even their smallest actions could reflect on her. A lady caught in a compromising situation might spark rumours implicating the queen herself, creating webs of scandal that blurred truth and invention. These rivalries remind us that sexual scandal was rarely about sex alone. It was a political tool, sharpened by those who sought advantage. Queens who won these battles, like Isabella of France, reshaped kingdoms. Queens who lost, like Joanna II, found their names forever associated with indulgence, whether deserved or not. Rivalries also show how fragile queens' reputations were. A king might recover from rumours of indulgence by demonstrating strength on the battlefield. A queen whose authority rested heavily on her perceived virtue had no such margin for error. For queens, sexual reputation was both armour and vulnerability. To be seen as virtuous was to command respect. To be seen as scandalous was to risk deposition, assassination, or historical defamation. Rivals knew this, and they wielded rumour with devastating effectiveness. But queens also knew how to fight back. Some cultivated images of piety, commissioning religious works to counteract accusations. Others leaned into their reputations, embracing the role of the seductive queen to gather loyal followers. Each strategy carried risks, but in the dangerous game of court rivalries, passivity was never an option. Queens and their rivals lived in a world where whispers could move armies and scandal could topple dynasties. Sexual politics was not a sideshow but a central arena of power. For every treaty signed in a council chamber, there was a rumour whispered in a palace corridor, shaping the fate of kingdoms just as decisively. In this world, queens were both players and pawns, forced to defend their dignity in courts that thrived on scandal. Their rivalries remind us that power in the Middle Ages was not only about crowns and swords, but also about reputations, whispered secrets, and the fragile line between desire and disgrace. At times, queens sought validation from the highest authority in Christendom, the Pope. A papal endorsement could silence rumours and reaffirm a queen's legitimacy. Conversely, papal disapproval could ruin her reputation and even her political position. Consider Catherine of Aragon, whose marriage to Henry VIII was first legitimised and later delegitimised by papal authority. Although her story belongs to the early modern era, it illustrates a broader truth. Queens lived under the constant threat that their sexual lives might be judged not only by courtiers and chroniclers but by Rome itself. Queens often commissioned religious works, chapels, altars, illuminated manuscripts, to counteract accusations and reinforce an image of piety. These acts served not only as personal devotion, but also as political messaging. A queen associated with patronage of the church could defend herself against scandal, presenting herself as a living model of Christian virtue. For example, Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, cultivated an image of strict piety. By aligning herself closely with the church, she avoided the sexual scandals that plagued other queens and instead was remembered as a moral guide for her saintly son. Yet not all queens were so fortunate. Religious authorities could become political enemies, condemning queens whose actions clashed with ecclesiastical interests. One stark example is Isabella of Angoulême, wife of King John of England. Chroniclers, many of them clerics, accused her of promiscuity and infidelity. Though much of this was politically motivated, the Church's role in recording and transmitting such claims ensured that Isabella's reputation was tarnished for centuries. The Church's influence meant that queens were often remembered in stark binaries: saint or sinner, Virgin Mary or Eve. Few were granted the complexity afforded to male rulers. A queen who managed to align herself with religious ideals could be celebrated as a paragon of virtue, like Margaret of Scotland, canonised for her piety and charity. A queen who strayed, or who was rumoured to stray, risked eternal branding as corrupt, no matter her political achievements. Religious authorities did more than police behaviour in their own time. They shaped how queens were remembered. Chroniclers in monasteries and cathedral schools wrote the histories that would define queens' reputations for centuries. If a queen had enemies within the church, those enemies had the power to immortalise her in scandal. This explains why queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, and Joanna II of Naples remain associated with sexual intrigue, while others, equally flawed, faded into obscurity. Their reputations were not simply products of their actions, but of the Church's decision to highlight or condemn them. For medieval queens, sexuality was never purely personal. It was theological, political, and symbolic. The Church's judgment determined whether a queen was remembered as virtuous or scandalous, as a guiding hand of kings, or as a dangerous Eve leading them astray. This constant scrutiny made queens vulnerable to rivals, chroniclers, and even their own confessors. Their private lives became public theology, and their reputations were measured not only by their courts but by the weight of the cross. The Church's power to shape morality meant that queens' sexuality was never fully their own. It was interpreted, judged, and often weaponized, a reminder that in medieval Europe, faith and power were inseparable, and that queens lived at the fragile intersection of desire, politics, and divine judgment. The accusations were not limited to Western Europe. In Byzantium, Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita, who ruled in the 11th century, was rumoured to use magical potions to maintain her youthful appearance and attract lovers. Byzantine culture, deeply influenced by both Christian and older pagan traditions, often framed powerful women as dangerous seductresses wielding charms. While Zoe wielded real political authority, her reputation was repeatedly undercut by claims that her influence derived from sorcery rather than from legitimate imperial power. In this way, gendered suspicion intersected with the politics of the supernatural, casting doubt on her rightful place in governance. scandal was never really about truth. It was about power. Queens' private lives became public instruments, their reputations molded and used as tools in struggles for influence. What seemed like stories about morality were often strategies for control, and a glance, a gesture, or a rumor could unravel entire alliances. If this interested you, consider liking and subscribing. It helps quietly keep these explorations going. And carry this question with you: who benefits when stories about bodies become public property? Let these stories rest now. History reminds us how power shaped even the most private parts of life.